So this video at this point is not intended to be released to the public, and it's complicated why that is. Mental conditioning is important, and I suggest reading Morals and Dogma from the last chapter back to the first, and then from the first to the end. So you read it twice, chapter by chapter from last to first, and then chapter by chapter from first to last. This will give you different perspectives on the book and help you understand where they're going before you start it, so you can see it from two different angles. Be all the more wiser. And I found that doing things such as this, has helped me increase my IQ dramatically. And I don't believe that intelligence can be measured so easily. And I do think that the biology book was right, that it's hard to measure, and background and education do contribute greatly to this. And I'll be touching on that momentarily. So let me just go through the things I've highlighted, give you some thoughts. I assure you they are not out of context, but you should read the 31st chapter. Grand Inspector, Inquisitor, Commander, Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma. If you harbor ill will, this is the third page of the 31st chapter. If you harbor ill will and jealousy, if you are hospitable to intolerance and bigotry, and churlish to gentleness and kind affections, opening wide your heart to one and closing its portals to the other, it is time for you to set in order your own temple, or else you wear in vain the name and insignia of a Mason, while yet uninvested with the Masonic nature. I think that Luciferianism, from what I see, from Pike's perspective, may be the point in which Lucifer was beginning to fall out of grace, but had not yet. So he had this very high standard of morality, yet he was on his way out because of his views on other things. And I think that it is like a great man who is about to go to a very dark place, who at his peak, where he felt he was powerful enough to challenge even God, that's the kind of mind state that they're looking at. That's the kind of philosophy they think might be superior. That's kind of the perspective that I get. But what I wanted to point out about that is the importance to not be a bigot. So we have to make the distinction between bigotry and being proud of your race to the point where you think your race is superior. Now, there are different forms of bigotry, right? One is completely hating another race. The form that Masons seem to think is acceptable is sort of too much pride in your race to where you think it's superior. Now, I think that almost every person who doesn't consider themselves a racist probably sees it this way. So it's very complicated. It takes a greater man to truly believe that his race isn't superior. And there's very few people like that. So going to the next place I highlighted, which is, we're on page 5 now, or, of the chapter. The book I have, the pages aren't numbered, so I'm going to have to number it like that and refer to it like that. Among men, some govern and others serve. Capital commands and labor obeys. And one race, superior in intellect, avails itself of the strong muscles of another that is inferior. And yet, for all this, no one impeaches the justice of God. So he's talking about the animals and how, the lion and the antelope, the hawk and the worm, the ants, and so on. And he's saying that our understanding of justice is not the same as God's. And so he believes, something I don't believe, obviously, that one race, which he almost certainly is referring to his own, is superior, and it is consistent with the justice of God. However, it is not that simple here. When you look at Masonry, there's a lot of balance here. It's like one could view that as a very dark philosophy. However, one could say that that is fair. I believe that it is unfair, but we'll go on and we'll get to that in a second. It goes on to say, our little measure of justice is not God's measure, in the next paragraph. So let us go to the next page. I believe that it's the 6th page in this. The ancients said that the child was punished for the sins of its father. We say that its deformity or disease is the consequence of its father's vices. But so far as concerns the question of justice or injustice, that is merely the change of a word. So we see a system that feeds into vices, and it says, well, if this person has superior intellect, he's going to avoid these vices. So if there's deformity or disease, according to Pike's version of Masonry, the Scottish Rite probably agrees with them, then it shows a lack of intellect and an inability to avoid these things. Just like psychiatry, when I was saying in the other video, that in many cases, a lot of people who end up victimized by psychiatry show an inability to avoid it if they are not completely opposed to the system. But you have the cases where some of the most wise and perceptive people fail to avoid psychiatry because of their wisdom and their lack of conformity, which shows a higher level of wisdom, which the Masons would disagree with, at least Pike, because they say you should be subjugated by the wisest and the best, therefore implying that naturally we see these bloodlines rising to the top and subjugating men, which is in accord with the justice of God, according to them. So then we go on to the next. We can explore this more in the comments if I ever release it, which I probably won't. So now 2 pages from that, did I say that was page 6, 7, 8? It was 2 pages from that one. Justice keeps just relations between men. It holds the balance between nation and nation, between a man and his family, tribe, nation, and race, so that his absolute rights and theirs do not interfere, nor their ultimate interests ever clash, nor the eternal interests of the one prove antagonistic to those of all or of any other one. This we must believe if we believe that God is just. We must do justice to all and demand it of all. It is a universal human debt, a universal human claim. A couple sentences later, well, we'll just finish the paragraph. But we may err greatly in defining what that justice is. The temporary interests in what to human view are the rights of men do often interfere and clash. The life interests of the individual often conflict with the permanent interest and welfare of society, and what may seem to be the natural rights of one class or race with those of another. So we see what appears to be a contradiction with what he said earlier about how, among men some govern and others serve, capital commands and labor obeys, and one race superior in intellect avail itself of the strong muscles of another that is inferior. But when you really examine it, it does not contradict it. Okay? Now, I don't agree with his perspective completely, but there's some truth in it. He's saying that, the best interests of society is the interests of society versus the interests of the individual versus the interests of the class and of a race. Okay? So he's saying, look, the eternal justice of God, the true justice, which is the justice of God, considers that one race is superior, and the interests of, say, the poor or the blacks or the rich, can conflict with the interests of the justice of God. He goes on to say, for example, and I didn't highlight this, but let's just try to breeze through this. It is not to say that one man, however little, must not be sacrificed to another, however great, to a majority or to all men. That is not only a fallacy, but a most dangerous one. Often one man and many men must be sacrificed, in the ordinary sense of the term, to the interest of the many. It is a comfortable fallacy to the selfish, for if they cannot by the law of justice be sacrificed for the common good, then their country has no right to demand of them self-sacrifice. And he is a fool who lays down his life or sacrifices his estate or even his luxuries to ensure the safety or prosperity of his country. According to the doctrine, Curtius was a fool and Leonidas an idiot, and to die for one's country is no longer beautiful and glorious, but a mere absurdity. Then it is no longer to be asked that the common soldier shall receive in his bosom the sword or bayonet thrust, which otherwise would let out the life of the great commander, on whose fate hangs the liberty of his country and the welfare of millions yet unborn. Okay, so that was a little tricky, but it's pretty straightforward. It's basically saying that the military proves that obvious fallacy, where we are asking people to sacrifice themselves and to lay down their lives for the betterment of the country. So to say that one man or a group of people shouldn't be sacrificed for the common good is a great fallacy. So they're basically applying the same scale that is used on the military on, say, the victims of eugenics for the common good. You see, this is how I knew that Masons and eugenicists go hand in hand. They even use the same kinds of wording. They're talking about the same sorts of things. And in this book, they seem to be beating around the idea that there is a system that, they're trying to bring about what they believe is the scale of God's justice by doing it themselves for the greater good of humanity. That idea is consistent with the eugenicists, who were mostly liberal progressives, but not exclusively. He goes on to say the physician must expose himself to pestilence for the sake of others, the sailor, and goes on and on. Okay? So let's he ends it by saying every progressive state, that page, revises its statutes and revolutionizes its constitution from time to time, seeking to come closer to the utmost possible practical justice and right, and sometimes following theorists and dreamers in their adoration for the ideal, by erecting into law a positive principle of theoretical right, works in practical injustice, and then has to retrace its steps. So it's basically saying, they use the word progressive, right? And they're saying that this is part of the progressive process for eugenicists to look at where they went wrong, to retrace their steps, and to correct it. Okay, of course, they're not using the word eugenicist. So let's just go on. I'm way behind schedule. These are not a couple of pages later, these are not departures from justice, though like other instances where their injury or death of the individual is the safety of the many, where the interest of one individual class or race is postponed to that of the public or of the superior race, they may infringe some dreamer's ideal rule of justice. So it's saying, look, there's going to be idealists who think that you're wrong, but you have to go back and look at the greater interests of society using the scale of the justice of God. He goes on to say, men honor all who stand up for truth and right and never shrink. So in this, you see appalling double standards if you were to look at this as being Masonic eugenics targeting me, right? Because of the most righteous men, those who stand up for truth and never shrink are among the most righteous men. And that's what I've been doing. When you go on to the next page, the hideous aspect of pauperism, the debasement and vice in our cities tell us by their eloquent silence or in inarticulate mutterings that the rich and the powerful and the intellectual do not do their duty by the poor, the feeble and the ignorant, and every wretched woman who lives. Heaven scarce scarce knows how by making shirts at 6 pence. Okay, it goes on and on. It says, you know, that there's cruelties being done, and that the powerful and the intellectual, you know, have the duty to keep these things from occurring. And of course, what is one way of doing it? Eugenics, you know, this hidden agenda of eugenics that reduces how many sluts there are, you know, how many licentious women, you know, they use the word pauperism that the eugenicists use, debasement and vice, you know, criminality, okay, and so on. He goes on to say in the next paragraph, whoso escapes a duty avoids a gain. So he's saying that, you know, not only is immorality, you know, wrong, right? It's your duty to be righteous, and it's your duty to perform your duty on society. And it's good for you spiritually to be a eugenicist if you connect what he's saying to eugenics. To be fair, he doesn't use the word eugenics, but it's very obvious, taking the period he lived in and the timeline of eugenics in America and psychiatry and what have you, it is very clear to me that this is the scale that eugenicists have been using to justify it. So when you say, well, the eugenicists are hypocrites, right? You got to look at exactly, you know, where they get it. It was a Mason who coined the term, and it's Masonic philosophy that drives the idea. And I'm not saying all Masons agree with eugenics, but certainly they haven't opposed it and highlighted where it comes from. So the second to last paragraph, the last page of the 31st degree. Justice will not fail, though wickedness appears strong and has on its side the armies and thrones of power, the riches and the glory of the world, and though poor men crouch down in despair, justice will not fail and perish out from the world of men. Nor what is really wrong and contrary to God's real law of justice continually endure. The power, the wisdom, and the justice of God are on the side of every just thought, and it cannot fail any more than God himself can perish. Now let's just finish this off. I'm going to give you the last paragraph of the 31st degree right now. All right. In human affairs, the justice of God must work by human means. Men are the instruments of God's principles. Our morality is the instrument of his justice, which, incomprehensible to us, seems to our short vision often to work injustice, but will at some time still the oppressor's brutal laugh. Justice is the rule of conduct written in the nature of mankind. We may, in our daily life, in house or field or shop, in the office or in the court, help to prepare the way for the commonwealth of justice, which is slowly, but we would fain hope, surely approaching. All the justice we mature will bless us here and hereafter, and at our death we shall leave it added to the common store of humankind. And every Mason who, content to do that which is possible and practicable, does and enforces justice, may help deepen the channel of human morality in which God's justice runs. And so the wrecks of evil that now check and obstruct the stream may the sooner be swept out and borne away by the resistless tide of omnipotent right. Let us, my brother, in this and as in all else, endeavor always to perform the duties of a good Mason and a good man. I actually did this video and I read this chapter perhaps even for the first time after I made the poem that I made in a video that I don't know, it's going to be uploaded around the time I upload this video, if I upload it, but it was certainly made before this video. It is Sunday. I'm getting late for church, if I'm not mistaken. Where's my phone? And yes, so just some closing thoughts. I think that the Scottish Rite, you know, specifically Pike, is wrong about a great many things, but he's right. I see it as somebody with what the liberals might call white privilege, although I'm not a liberal, but for the sake of explanation and communication, I will use that term. He is justifying the rule of the rich and the subjugation of the poor by using things that are true. There is a bigger picture. God's justice is different than ours. However, I think he's blinded by racial pride, and I don't believe, and there's a lack of science in his approach. As we've learned over the years, intelligence is hard to measure. So one of his key points there is, yes, white people are doing better than blacks. He's living in a time of slavery, right, where they're using their quote-unquote intellect to subjugate slaves, when really it is their education and background to get over on people who may or may not be less intelligent than they are. And by putting them all in one category, I mean, we see some whites who are, special, developmentally challenged, mentally challenged. We see some blacks who are born with, gifts, gifts related to intelligence. However, it is hard to measure intelligence nonetheless. So I think that he's right about a lot of things, but he's wrong about key things that just destroy his argument. And the idea of eugenics, is wrong. And I think that he does make a powerful case for it, that it is part of the human process, and so is correcting things. And whatever happened was meant to happen and is in accord with human development, human progress, and the justice of God. He makes a powerful case for that. And it is pretty hard to disprove that. But one thing is for certain, is that we are at a point where the current process of eugenics, even if you use his scale and you follow his train of thought, is outdated. We are screening out the wisest and the best who are defying an unfair, unjust, and immoral system. So when you look at human morality as a scale to do the work of God, or God's justice, which is what he says in the 31st degree chapter, eugenics is failing to meet up to the requirements. Therefore, it is doing the devil's work, because if it is not morality, using their own scale, if it is not morality that is driving eugenics, then and therefore it is not the work of God, then it must be the work of the devil and selfishness that is driving modern eugenics. But one more important question must be asked: is it moral to do eugenics in the first place, or not to simply let man's morality and his nature, and let nature run its course while refining morality? Is morality in itself not the mechanism that God uses to smooth out reproduction, to balance reproduction, to create human progress, for human development, and for purposes of advancing